There's absolutely no area where I see more ignorance and even outright disdain than when it comes to the Constitution and war powers and the founders' foreign policy views. So today I want to give an introduction to their foreign policy approach. And to do that, I'm going to break it down into three sections. First of all, a quick set of quotes from various founders to give an overview of their views about war in general. It's not a very positive one. And then, of course, how they went out of their way to make getting into war more difficult under the Constitution. Then we also have some of the precursors, who they actually learn from when it comes to foreign policy. We're talking specifically Vattel today. There are many others. And then tying it all together into a foreign policy from the founding generation. If you haven't checked out Brian McClanahan's podcast, I think it was yesterday on the 10th of October, where he really focused on Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural and tying that into a foreign policy of peace, commerce, no entangling alliances. I'll mention Jefferson as a little bit in this episode here today as well, but you really should check out Brian McClanahan's episode on that from yesterday as well. It was really, really awesome. It's been my morning walk. I'm listening to Brian basically every day, and I encourage you to do so as well if you want more of this type of stuff. But let's kick it off with some views on war. And here's John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States, in a letter to Gouverneur Morris, who was the guy who is known as the drafter of the preamble to the Constitution. This is a letter of September 24th, 1783, and the date is pretty significant because John Jay was one of the people who was negotiating the Treaty of Paris to officially end the war for independence. Not the American Revolution, because the revolution was the radical change in the views of the people, and the war was what they had to do to get away from the empire. This was literally 21 days to the day after he helped negotiate that Treaty of Paris in September of 1783. And here's how John Jay put it. While there are knaves and fools in the world, there will be wars in it. Oh, that says quite a bit. And he says, and that nations should make war against nations is less surprising than their living in uninterrupted peace and harmony. How about Thomas Paine in The Rights of Man, Part 1, 1791? He said, I have seen enough of the miseries of war to wish it might never more have existence in the world. This is the guy who in December of 1776, these are the times that try men's souls. He's pushing people, urging people to push on against all odds because the British claim power over the people in all cases whatsoever. He said the only person, or the only one who has that kind of unlimited power, according to Paine, was God, and any government that claimed it had to be resisted. And that's what they were doing. So he's saying, I've seen enough of the miseries of war to wish it might never more have existence in the world, and that some other mode might be found out to settle the differences that should occasionally arise in the neighborhood of nations. I wish it was just occasionally, but that's the way he put it. He said, war is the common harvest. Think about this. This was a very common view. War was a way that people in power consolidated their power, whether they were in defense or on offense. People in power or advantageous, or people who are looking to take advantage of the situation, even if there were good people in there at the time, which almost never happens, they would try to come in and use that situation to expand power, push for more expansive power. And once you give them a little bit more, it never goes back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle without, well, a lot of resistance. And here's how Paine put it. War is the common harvest of all those who participate in the division and expenditure of public money in all countries. So for Thomas Paine, war was a ripoff. It was a way that in every country all through history they would do this. He said, it is the art of conquering at home. The object of it is an increase of revenue. And as revenue cannot be increased without taxes, a pretense must be made for expenditure. And he explained there that if you look through the history of the British wars, he says taxes were not raised to carry on wars, but wars were raised to carry on taxes. And here's John Jay again here in the Federalist Papers in number 4. He didn't write too many of them, but this is one of the first ones. And here he is in support of ratification of the Constitution, pointing out again, this is about war. He said, "It is too true, however disgraceful it may be to human nature, that nations in general will make war whenever they have a prospect of getting anything by it." Now we're getting closer to what we want to get into, what they did in the Constitution. The founders recognized that governments, when they have too much power, and governments, when they have too much opportunity, will, in general, get into war. And war is incredibly destructive. Here is James Monroe in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He said, "The causes of half the wars that have thinned the ranks of mankind and depopulated nations are caprice, folly, and ambition. These belong to the higher orders of governments, where the passions of one or of a few individuals direct the rest of the community." So he's basically saying that, the people in power, the people with something to gain, they will drive countries to war. Now, there are popular wars as well, where the people themselves drive government to it, but it's generally, I think in my experience or my reading of history, it's the other way around. But people fall for it because they're afraid. And James Madison, of course, had written to Thomas Jefferson in the run-up to the Alien and Sedition Acts in a war fever time in 1798 that he said that perhaps it is a universal truth that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged against provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. So people with power will always use fear of invasion, fear of danger from foreign entities, foreign nations, as a way to consolidate their power and, of course, to destroy liberty. And here's Madison again, and one that I cite all the time. Political Observations, April 20th, 1795. "Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded." And if you think about that, here's the father of the Constitution, not some California liberal or Massachusetts progressive, something like that. This is James Madison telling us that of all the threats to liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. And he tells us why: because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. Madison continued with, "War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few." Armies and debts and taxes all come from war. We have a trifecta. Well, I guess what's the fourth one there? But we have all of them, and they never seem to stop growing. Madison warned us because he was a student of history, and this is what they lived through. I covered that in another episode. This is basically a short, quick explanation of what they went through from the end of the so-called 7 Years' War, the French Indian War in 1763, where they got lots of debt from the war, and the British said, "Well, we protected you, so now you have to pay these taxes, and we're going to keep a standing army, thousands of troops here to protect you, and there will be armies, and you'll have debts and taxes," and over and over. And when they resisted some of those taxes, then, of course, the British kept ramping it up and up and up until, well, it went down to a gun confiscation program in late 1774, and we know what happened. Lexington and Concord with gun control in 1775. One more time from Thomas Paine. He said, "Not all the treasures of the world, so far as I believe, could have induced me to support an offensive war, for I think it murder." So the founders were okay with, they weren't pacifists, obviously. John Jay was no pacifist. Neither was Benjamin Franklin, who also wrote just days after helping negotiate that Treaty of Paris. He said there never was a good war or a bad peace. He wasn't a pacifist, but he recognized that even when you were fighting a just war, a defensive war, it was a horrible thing. This is not something to be celebrated or looked towards as a goal. This is something to be rejected. It should be slowed down. You should never, ever get into an offensive war, according to Paine. It's murder. He said, "But if a thief breaks into my house, burns and destroys my property, and kills or threatens to kill me, or those that are in it, and to bind me in all cases whatsoever," that's the Declaratory Act of 1766, "to his absolute will, am I to suffer it? What signifies it to me whether he who does it is a king or a common man, my countrymen or not my countrymen, whether it be done by an individual villain or an army of them?" So a strong support of just war theory, of self-defense, but never in support of offensive war. And I know everyone today seems to think that the best defense is a good offense, but not to the founders. Here's Oliver Ellsworth. Because of these views, the founders went out of their way to make getting into war difficult. They really wanted to do that in the Constitution itself. Oliver Ellsworth, I believe he was the third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He put it this way in the Philadelphia Convention when they were debating declare versus make war as the text of the Constitution. He said it should be more easy to get out of war than into it. George Mason, right after that, said he was for clogging rather than facilitating war, but for facilitating peace. If you talk about peace or being against war today, a lot of people on the right call you some kind of a hippie, some kind of a progressive, a commie, a socialist. But Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, used the word peace at least 7 times. We should be supportive of peace. James Wilson, in his July 4th, 1788 oration, he said, let us begin with peace. This should be our mindset. Start with peace because that's how you get more prosperity. If you want to get rich and powerful, you start with peace, not the other way around. So George Mason was also in support. So you have the Federalist Ellsworth and you have the Anti-Federalist Mason, both saying we got to make it slow to get into war. We want to slow this down. We want to clog it, as Mason put it, and facilitate peace. Here's John Jay again. Here's his speech. This is an interesting speech at the opening of the Circuit Court at Richmond in May of 1793. So this is in his role as, well, he's on the circuit, but he was the Chief Justice at this point. He said, until, well, 17, I might be having my dates wrong. Anyways, John Jay put it this way. Until war is constitutionally declared, the nation and all its members must observe and preserve peace. And we'll get into what that means here in just a few minutes. James Wilson, this system will not hurry us into war. It is calculated to guard against it. Here he is. That was in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention. James Wilson was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court. He was one of the big government guys of the time, arch federalists at the time. He wasn't as bad as Gouverneur Morris or Alexander Hamilton, but in comparison today, even the big government guys from that time seem like tiny government guys today, people that don't even exist in positions of power. And here he is saying in the ratification debates, look, we've gone out of our way to slow down the process of getting into war. And I know a lot of people tell us, oh, yeah, but if you follow the founders, someone might attack and then you have to wait for a declaration of war and we're going to all be dead. And so they use this fear mongering, not understanding that the process doesn't include, like if someone attacks, you don't have to wait to assemble a bunch of people and have a bunch of debate. The executive branch can fight that off without any action of Congress if there is an actual attack. And under the founders' view, what a war is a use of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. That was a pretty common dictionary definition at the time of ratification. Use of violence under sovereign command against such as oppose. So a single attack, a single use of violence can be seen as an act of war, and it's actually the job of the executive branch to do something about it. So, but getting into war when there is a state of peace, choosing to go into war, they went out of their way to slow that process down, clog it. This system will not hurry us into war. It is calculated to guard against it. And James Madison actually really hammered that view home in Helvidius paper number 4 in 1793. He said, in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department. They recognized, the founding generation recognized that it was the executive who was most interested in war, as Madison put it, and most prone to it. And that's why they went out of their way to tell the government, to tell the people that the government was not going to have the power to choose whether there will be peace or war in the hands of a single person. That would never happen. That's what they left. That's what happens all the time today, unfortunately, but that's what the system was created to do. Now, putting this all together, we're going to get these views. This is a quick take. Of course, it's an introduction. If you want to read more of this stuff that I'm just citing, I'm really just scratching the surface. I want to point out that we're going to have this covered all in a blog post, which we publish. Alan Mosley gets it all organized. I get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And for each episode, there is an individual blog post. As you scroll down, you'll see all the latest episodes. As you get further down the page, if you want to just keep going through it, there's various categories that I think we need to update and kind of improve a little bit on, but we'll work on that sometime soon. But basically, once you see that blog post published, there will be a couple of different sections. Let me see if I can open one up here. Property rights are the foundation of all the rest. This was last Fast Friday episode last week. And at the top, you get a quick overview. And then you have an audio player, different audio platforms we're on, a video player, and then a show links section. So when you're thinking, hey, where's that debate in the Philadelphia Convention? August 17th, 1787, Oliver Ellsworth, George Mason, others. Well, you'll find a link to it there in the show links section. And then, of course, all the different video sources we're on as well. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. I hope you had a great weekend. For me, it was a little bit of a longer weekend because I was away on a wedding, which is why I took off on Monday. But really glad to be back here today. There's Leslie G. Good to see you, Leslie. Sparrow Dynamics, Howard, Douglas, Irwin. There's Haji, Cheriton Farmer, Rick in Michigan, Angie Clark, Kirk, Tim Martin, good to see you, and everyone else. Anderson as well. Richard Banks, been a while since I've seen you. Good to see you here. And I know I'm skipping over a few people, but I'll look back in the chat later in the episode if I don't go too long, because there's a lot of info to cover here. Otherwise, I will look at it a little bit later today or tomorrow. You can also email me with questions or show suggestions at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Anyways, back to it. We're putting all these things together. The founders were not fans of war. They were not out looking for war. They were actually going out of their way to make sure that, well, these United States of America would be in a place of peace because they wanted to be rich and strong and powerful and free. And you don't get freedom, as you can see what Madison had to say. War is the greatest threat to public liberty. You don't get freedom when you're in a state of continual war. And that's exactly what he said following up those quotes. He talked about how you'd get more executive power, etc. And he said no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual war. And if you were born in any time in the last 20 some odd years, you've lived in a state of continual war. Now, how long does it take before you have no freedom left? Depends on how you define all that. Anyway, so putting all those together for a true foreign policy of the founding generation, when it comes to foreign policy, they really went to something known as the Law of Nations, or what we now call, that was a precursor to what we now call international law. That's not UN enforced something. This was a mode of conduct that all nations were supposed to act under. It was primarily driven by a guy named Vattel. There are others. Rob Natelson did a great article on this in his series, The Ideas That Formed the Constitution, Vattel and the Law of Nations. I'm not really citing anything from that in this episode today, but I wanted to point you to that article if you wanted to get a better overview in the background of some of the other people. There's like 4 or 5 main people that the founders basically learned from and incorporated their ideas when it comes to foreign policy. Vattel, I think, to me, is the most important. Other people, maybe Joe Wolverton, can educate me on others that are probably have a lot of influence as well. But Vattel was incredibly important. And his Law of Nations, which was first published, I think, in 1758, it made its way over to these United States somewhere in the early 1760s. Benjamin Franklin and many others thought it was incredibly important work. And here's some important quotes talking about neutrality when there's other countries at war. He said, "Neutral nations are those who in time of war do not take any part in the contest, but remain common friends to both parties without favoring the arms of the one to the prejudice of the other." We don't see much of that today. This is kind of, some people would say, this is basically how Switzerland has approached a lot of things. But Switzerland has not avoided war throughout its history. The founding generation discussed this in the ratification debates, but that's generally how people look at things. Staying neutral. We're not going to get involved. Vattel goes on. As long as a neutral nation wishes securely to enjoy the advantages of her neutrality, because being neutral, being at peace, is a huge advantage. War is the greatest threat to liberty. If war is a threat to liberty, it gives you armies and debts and taxes. No nation wants to be at war. I know a lot of people are very war hungry today. They want to fight and show dominance, or they want other people to fight and show dominance. They want to station people in 150 places around the world, the largest military budget, not defense, offensive military budget in the world, and more than maybe the most 8 or 10 next countries combined. This is absurd to the founding generation. They would put more time and energy towards paying off the debt and keeping things more free. But it's positive to be in a neutral position. And of course, the founders often talked about how our geographic setup really helped that. It got us away from all the ancient conflicts of Europe, the East, elsewhere. And we can still stay far, technology is different today, clearly, but we still have natural barriers that help us be able to stay neutral should the people actually want it. The politicians certainly don't. It's going to take a lot of people who demand it. But anyways, as long as a neutral nation wishes securely to enjoy the advantages of her neutrality, she must in all things, show a strict impartiality towards the belligerent powers. For should she favor one of the parties to the prejudice of the other, she cannot complain of being treated by him as an adherent and confederate of his enemy. In essence, when you pick sides and you do things basically how, the imperial government in Washington, D.C. has done for basically all of our lives, always choosing one side or another in foreign conflicts because they want to basically pick and choose winners for the whole world. They want to they're in charge of the whole globe. And that's not what the system that they created in the Constitution for the United States was creating. It wasn't creating a world government, but certainly that's how a lot of people like it today, and that's what they're pushing for all the time. But the only way to be neutral is to take no side whatsoever. No impartiality at all. And what is impartiality according to Vattel? 1, to give no assistance when there is no obligation to give it. So if there's been no treaty that said you have to give assistance in this situation, we're going to get to treaties in a moment because they didn't like permanent alliances either. But unless there's a treaty that says you have to give support, you should do absolutely nothing. And that's what impartiality is. So what is impartiality according to Vattel? 1, to give no assistance when there is no obligation to give it, nor voluntarily to furnish troops, arms, ammunition, or anything of direct use in war. For many of the founders, for many of the old revolutionaries, for many of the thinkers of the time and before, like Vattel, getting involved with arms, ammunition, troops, and otherwise to one side or another of a war is, in essence, being part of that war. You are declaring war by your action. And it's not impartial, it's not neutral, it's not staying at peace whatsoever. You are just taking a different type of role. And Vattel goes on, he says, I do not say to give assistance equally. He goes out of his way to say you can't even furnish troops, arms, or ammunition, or anything of direct use in a war if you're just furnishing one side, but also if you try to furnish both sides. I mean, we've seen things like that happen in the Middle East for many years, where they're basically giving some kind of funding or military support to both sides of a conflict. This goes back many generations. And he says, I do not say give assistance equally, but give no assistance. For it would be absurd that a state should at one and the same time assist two nations at war with each other, and besides, it would be impossible to do it with equality. And many times I think there's probably a policy goal of keeping other people fighting amongst each other so they don't have to worry about what you're doing. And maybe there's something into that as well. So that's 1, give no assistance whatsoever, no military assistance whatsoever to either side or both. If you claim, well, we're helping out both sides, so we're neutral, that's a line of, garbage. Number 2, in whatever does not relate to war, a neutral and impartial nation must not refuse to one of the parties on account of his present quarrel what she grants to the other. So if you're I don't know. There's all kinds of sanctions sanctions are an act of war. Providing military assistance to one side and not the other is an act of war. Providing military assistance to both sides is an act of war. Logistics support, equipment, money, etc. If you're providing, for example, I don't know, medical supplies, if you provide it to one team and then you say, well, you guys can't have it, then that is also involving yourself in war. You're no longer neutral. And that's how John Jay described it again in 1793. Again, this is the first Chief Justice, one of the top legal minds of the time, and one of the leading Federalist supporters of the Constitution. He pointed out that strict impartiality is our duty in all cases where prior treaties do not stipulate for favors, and it is no less our interest than our duty to act accordingly. So John Jay is reiterating pretty much what Vattel said in 1758, or when it finally made it to the colonies in the 1760s. Strict impartiality in all areas. And he said, unless there is a treaty or a requirement to get involved one way or another, he said, we ought to observe a strict impartiality towards both sides, abstaining from affording military aid of any kind or giving just cause of offense to either. So if you provide military aid to one side of a war, you are basically part of that war. You are, in essence, declaring war by your actions, because a declaration of war can happen if you drop a missile on somebody. You're telling people you're at a state of war. According to the Constitution, that would be an immoral, unjust, unconstitutional way because it requires Congress to take that action. And if the executive branch does that, they are usurping power, stealing the power to make that decision away from the representatives of the people and of the states. But that is an act of war and thus changing the state of things from peace to war. Strict impartiality, according to John Jay as well. Back to Vattel, if this page loads. He talks about trade. What kind of things can you do in trade? Can you trade with nations at war? And he says, absolutely. He said the first is carefully to distinguish ordinary goods which have no relation to war from those that are peculiarly I have trouble with that word. The first is carefully to distinguish ordinary goods which have no relation to war from those that are peculiarly subservient to it. Neutral nations should enjoy perfect liberty to trade in the former. Perfect liberty. So there should be no restriction on continuing commerce with either side of a war. And now, if you're choosing that you don't want to be neutral, that's a different situation. But it's not up to the executive branch to make that decision. I could probably do a follow-up episode discussing that, where Madison talks about this is not something for the executive branch to decide. Only Congress can make the decision of whether or not things will change from a state of peace to war. That's what declare war means legally under the Constitution. So if you're choosing sides, you are now engaging in that war. You're doing things that are an act of war, whether it's just providing arms and ammunition, you're doing a blockade, doing logistical support, radar, whatever technology that you're involved in, cash, etc. If you're no longer impartial, you're not neutral. That's not up to the executive branch. It's still required to be done by Congress. Now, sometimes that does happen. But anyways, the first is carefully to distinguish which those. Now, neutral nations should enjoy perfect liberty to trade in the ordinary goods which have no relation to war. The belligerent powers cannot with any reason refuse it or prevent the importation of such goods into the enemy's country. So if they try to do that, then they are actually committing an act of war against, well, so let's say the United States, let's say China and Taiwan. That's another one where a lot of bloodthirsty war hawks really want to get the United States involved in a global war. Let's say their conflict breaks out between China and the people of Taiwan. Of course, the Chinese government thinks that Taiwan is theirs, and Taiwan government thinks that they're separate or independent, if I'm getting that right. But let's say you decide to trade with the people in Taiwan, and China comes in and starts confiscating your ships. If you're just sending ordinary goods which have no relation to war, this is an act of war by China on the United States. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm not sure if it's a good analogy or if I got the situation between those two peoples or one people correct, but that's another story. Now, commodities, Vattel points out, particularly useful in war and the importation of which to an enemy is prohibited, are called contraband goods. So basically, when you're trading in things that are war tools, this is called contraband. You shouldn't be doing this because if you are now a belligerent in the war. He said such are arms, ammunition, timber for shipbuilding, every kind of naval stores, horses, and even provisions in certain junctures when we have hopes of reducing the enemy by famine. So it's a different type of warfare, of course, as well. But if you are engaged in that kind of stuff, you are picking a side, one or that or the other. Now, in that situation, let's say you are in a situation where you have been trading some of those contraband goods, tools of war with one nation or the other. And the other nation says, hey, now, well, what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to inform the neutral country of the declaration of war on the other people that you've been trading with. The neutral country is then supposed to tell their own people to refrain from trading that contraband stuff and tell them if they continue to do so. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't, but if they continue to do so, no protection will be given if seized. That's Vattel's version. John Jay took a much more strict version of this, where he said, well, the people of the several states delegated the power to declare war to Congress. That is to make a decision whether or not the country would be involved in war or stay in a state of peace. So if people act as belligerents in a war, he said they're not allowed to do that because that's been delegated. Now, if the people want to change that and take that decision away from Congress, they need to amend the Constitution to do that. Otherwise, until war is declared, as he put it, let me see if I can find that quote one more time. Until war is constitutionally declared, the nation and all its members must observe and preserve peace. So let me see if I can get back to where I was. So putting this all together, of course, these views from Vattel, these views on war, the structure of the Constitution, we get to Thomas Jefferson's foreign policy from his first inaugural. You may be familiar with the famous line where he said, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Entangling alliances also involve like permanent treaties, permanent alliances, or treaties that compel action. And James Madison discussed this in a letter to Jefferson as well in 1798. He said, if again a treaty when made obliges the legislature to declare war contrary to its judgment, and in pursuance of the same doctrine a law declaring war imposes a like moral obligation to grant the requisite supplies until it be formally repealed with the consent of the President and Senate, it is evident that the people are cheated out of the best ingredients in their government, the safeguards of peace, which is the greatest of their blessings. Peace, safeguards of peace is the greatest part, the wisest part of the Constitution. It's the greatest of the blessings for the people. And so just to kind of simplify what Madison is saying here, if you have a treaty with another country, let's say you sign a treaty in 1950, and it's 2050, and the treaty is still in effect, and people in power, generations have come and gone, and you're still obliged to go to war without following the Constitution. As soon as something happens to that country, you're cheating people. This really is, in essence, this is a way of doing an end run around the Constitution. James Madison considered it cheating. I would call it absolutely unconstitutional. Anyways, here's George Washington. He said, observe good faith and justice towards all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. And this is from his very famous farewell address of 1796, first drafted by James Madison in 1792, revised after Jefferson and others convinced Washington to stay longer than one term, revised under Washington's guidance by Alexander Hamilton in 1796. But he talked quite a bit about foreign policy and peace. He said, in the execution, so the plan is to George Washington. This is the foreign policy of the Washington administration, which is very similar to that of the Jefferson administration. Observe good faith and justice towards all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. And Washington says, In the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded, and that in place of them, just and amicable feelings towards all should be cultivated. Do not have permanent hatred or love towards any other foreign country. We're talking about commerce. We're talking about peace and harmony. They're going to do their things. We are going to lead by example. The nation, he said, which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. You're a slave to another country in that scenario. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. You are not a strong country if you are tied to the whims of the people in power of another country. Whether they're just or not, you are not free. You are subservient. I mean, do you want to be part of the British Empire or somebody else's empire? Absolutely not. We're talking about trying to establish independence and freedom here. He said the nation, prompted by ill will and resentment, sometimes impels to war the government, contrary to the best calculations of policy. The government sometimes participates in the national propensity and adopts through passion what reason should reject. At other times, it makes the animosity of the nation subservient to projects of hostility instigated by pride, ambition. You think of these things that James Monroe said in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, what leads to war, what Thomas Paine talked about when it comes to war, pride, ambition, and other sinister and pernicious motives. The peace often, sometimes perhaps the liberty of nations has been the victim. That's when you have basically permanent support or permanent hatred of other nations. And that's why Washington concluded that view with, it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. Not just most of it, not just in certain regions, but with any portion of the foreign world. And if you think about it, we can tie this all together. We get some main principles from these views. One, all the founders agreed that war is a horrible evil. Again, Benjamin Franklin summed it up best when he said, there never was a good war or a bad peace. This was literally right after he helped put together the Treaty of Paris. He was in support of the war for independence. He recognized it was a just war, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't also accompanied by a bunch of horrible evils. So war is horrible. So it should be difficult to start. Two, don't pick sides in any foreign conflict. Don't pick sides. That includes don't fund either side, because that really is, in essence, an act of war. Instead, trade with everyone on earth. Lead by example. And then other nations, of course, number three, other nations can't be trusted. You can't trust. They're not under your control. I know with all the loot that they send around as so-called foreign aid, they try to get people kind of under their thumb, and maybe they can direct the way they want things to go. But you can't trust other nations and other peoples to stay at peace with each other, so don't make permanent alliances with them. Because if you do, you're going to get in a situation where you're acting as a slave to that other nation. And that includes treaties which require acts of war. Now, if you want to get involved in a war directly or even providing war supplies, it always requires a declaration of war from Congress. And then ultimately, number five, that was number four, number five, as Patrick Henry warned us, we really do have a choice. We had a choice in 1788 in the Virginia Ratifying Convention where he really discussed this in some detail, and we still have that choice today. We can either have liberty or we can have an empire, but it's impossible to have both. Now, there's absolutely nothing that helps us get this kind of information, these foundational principles, out to more and more people, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have lifetime, annual, and 5-year options. So if you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing, depreciating, throw it our way. No one punches above their weight better than the TAC. Over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I've gone a little bit longer than I hoped to today, but I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I will check through the chat a little bit later today. Please do continue leaving comments, especially in the archive, reviews on Apple Podcasts, other podcast platforms, smashing the like button. All these things can help trigger algorithms of the mainstream platform and get our show out to more and more people. I really appreciate your consideration and your help on that and on our membership program and, well, everything else. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a great day, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.